I am a nude formalist poet, a sprung syntax poet, a multi-track poet, a wandering poet, a social expressionist poet, a Baroque poet, a constructivist poet. An idiolectical poet. I am a New York poet in California, a San Francisco poet on the Lower East Side, an objectivist poet in Royaumont, a surrealist poet in Jersey, a bald poet, a virtual poet. And I am none of these things, nothing but the blank wall of my aversions, writ large in disappearing ink. All of the identities in the poem, of which there are dozens, are not arbitrary. They're maybe comic, but they're not used as examples of things that I can't be engaged with. Every single instance of the contradictory and multiple identities are things that I identify with in different contexts. I am a serial poet, a paratactic poet, a disjunctive poet, a discombobulating poet, a montage poet, a collage poet, a hypertextual poet, a nonlinear poet, an abstract poet, a non-representational poet, a process poet, a polydiscourse poet, a conceptual poet. Identity is a flow of contradictory and uncontainable directions and possibilities and histories, and that you can hear the rhythm of the connection between them. So I'm not interested in saying that I don't have an identity or that identity is not something that's fundamental to what I do. Actually, my view about the relation of identity to poetry is that it's fundamental. I'm looking for making identity even a more robust dimension within the way my poetry is read, as well as the way I write poetry. Those of us who came of age in the 60s, in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, who were profoundly affected by feminism, the way in which we expressed our politics wasn't through theme and making poems that were thematically about those subjects, but went to the very substance of reimagining our language use, embracing multiplicities of language use, and relentlessly mocking concepts of standardization and hierarchy, that one kind of language use is better than another, that high is better than low, but also, which is the current situation, that low or mass culture is the only culture that counts. Even my explanations need explication, my commentaries elucidations, my prefaces glosses, my shadows shadows. Language Magazine gives a historical and archival ground for the often speculative essays. I edited Language Magazines, and that can't really be said, but it's the equal signs between the letters. So that was the name of the magazine, L equals A, between 1978 and 1981 with Bruce Andrews. That magazine tried to bring together a number of very discrepant and otherwise not juxtaposed investigations and thinking about poetry, including historical and contemporary poets. So rather than a representation of an already existing group or movement or school, it was an attempt to bring together conversations that were going on within a focus. But the focus was on the conversation and on the way in which language can materialize itself, be focused on its verbality, its wordness. So for me, essential to that project was contradiction and multiplicity. It wasn't about a point of view, but was about bringing together a number of different points of view which are not represented within the mainstream. This line is stripped of emotion. This line is no more than an illustration of a European theory. This line is bereft of a subject. This line has no reference apart from the context in this line. This line is only about itself. This line has no meaning. Its words are imaginary. It sounds inaudible. This line cares not for itself or for anyone else. It is indifferent, impersonal, cold, uninviting. This line is elitist, requiring to understand it years of study in stultifying libraries, poring over esoteric treatises on impossible to pronounce topics. This line refuses reality. This line is one section from a longer serial poem called Republic of Reality. It's a satiric response, I guess, to the idea that the kind of writing I'm interested in, so-called difficult poetry, is illegible or impossible to understand or very theoretical, which I strongly disagree with. And I think that it's a way of avoiding the ineffable and the incomparable aspects of everyday life. So to say that you can't understand things that are difficult or that can't be coherently represented or explained, it would mean that you can't, take a walk. You can't exist in the world that I'm in. It means you'd have to rationalize everything. Of time and the line. George Burns likes to insist that he always takes the straight lines. The cigar in his mouth is a way of leaving space between the lines for a laugh. He weaves lines together by means of a picaresque narrative. Not so Henny Youngman, whose lines are strictly paratactic. Henny Youngman was the king of the one-liners, so he had these great jokes that really could exist as single lines. I use a Henny Youngman joke in another poem of mine, so I can give you an example of that. I went to my doctor and I said, "It hurts when I lift up my arm." He said, "Don't do that." And then his whole routine, which could be an hour, was just a set of disconnected jokes of this kind, with a one-line finish with a setup. So really, two sentences. And I love that rapidity. And George Burns also, who with Gracie Allen had a great program on television every week in the 1950s that I watched, the Burns and Allen show. I wanted to somehow bring them into the kind of cultural space of my poetry. My father pushed a line of ladies' dresses, not down the street in a pushcart, but upstairs in a factory office. My mother has often been more concerned with her hemline. Chairman Mao put forward Maoist lines, but that's been abandoned mostly for the east-west line of malarkey so popular in these parts. Of Time in the Line is all 10-syllable lines. The 10 syllables are not created through iambic pentameter rhythm, but just by counting the syllables. So sometimes the line breaks occur in the middle of words, and yet the 10-syllable lines do create a discernible rhythm when you read them. And I'm interested in that aspect of way lines, and especially enjambment, that is to say, breaking the lines against the end of phrases, in the middle of phrases, so even in the middle of words, creates a different kind of humor. But it's also like a piece of paper that's cut off and has a rough edge, but you still feel the edge because it comes to the end after a certain, temporal or anyway syllabic unit. It's also my tribute to Jewish comedians that I liked very much. I mean, Jewish comedy has been a fundamental resource for me as much as literary sources. The prestige of the iambic line has recently suffered decline, since it's no longer so clear who I am. I am a fraudulent poet, an incomprehensible poet, a degenerate poet, an incompetent poet, an indecorous poet, a crude poet, an incoherent poet, a flat-footed poet, a disruptive poet, a fragmenting poet, a contradictory poet, a self-imploding poet, a conspiratorial poet, an ungainly poet, an anti-dogmatic poet. I am a Jewish poet hiding in the shadow of my great-grandfather and great-grandmother. One of the concerns that a lot of us had in the mid-70s was the way in which not voice as it was understood, but a certain stylistic and rhetorical attitude to voice had been naturalized, and that it had also completely dominated the conception of what expression is. So one way you could think about it in a negative way, what we were doing was that we were against voice and against expression. I would say that my argument has always been, and if you go back and read my early essays, I say this over and over, it was the work that I was criticizing that was against voice and expression. That voice that was limited to a very narrow register and had a particular tone and diction, that was against voicing and the voices, vernacular, multiplicity, idiolect, which is fundamental to speech and to language, vernacular language, and indeed literary language as it's been used by multiple different people in different kinds with different stylistic approaches. The same with expression. If you have to express something in a rule-bound way, and that if you do it this way, it's thought to be expressive, but if you don't say it right, you're slapped on the wrist and say it again, because expression has to be done in these fixed ways. That's not the kind of expression I'm interested in. I'm interested in expression which often is hostile to expressiveness, is often stuttering, is often inconclusive. Camaraderie turns to rivalry when 12 medical students learn that only 7 of them will be admitted to the hospital. A CIA agent is ordered to feign a breakdown to trap a spy at a mental hospital. A field study of Zululand's mosquitoes and velvet monkeys revealed them to be carriers of viral diseases that cause high fever and bone-racking pain. Defeat comes to the Nazi conqueror. Film footage highlights the February bombing of Dresden, the advance over the Rhine, through the Ruhr, and into the heart of Germany. And from the east, the Russian encirclement of Berlin. The poem is taken from synopsises from TV Guide of I think of it as the 1950s, but it's probably early 1960s. TV Guide was something that I read religiously when I was a kid. I watched a lot of TV. I'm a generation that's born in 1950. I'm probably one of the first people as a child who would have grown up with television in their room. So I had my own TV, and I was very absorbed with TV. So if somebody who knows the TV of that period could recognize the Lucille Ball show or I Dream of Jeannie, some of the popular shows of the time. Bilko feverishly schemes for a way to escape the summer's heat. Lucy makes an impression on her first day at her new job when she breaks the water cooler and floods the office. Genocide. Graphic film footage depicts Hitler's persecution and extermination of the Jewish population in Germany and in the occupied countries. It was partly the way I wanted to talk about the systematic extermination of the European Jews and the Second World War, and also the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These events, which are the kind of catastrophic world events that occurred, 5 to 10 years before I was born. So I was born into that world where those things had just occurred, and there was no real way of assimilating them in the 50s. They would come in the middle of these absolutely silly plots, and then you'd have these World War II documentaries. So I was interested in that, the contradiction of that, and also the rivalry of those different kinds of synopsis. And of course, the TV Guide is itself a kind of paratactic. Paratactic means juxtaposition. So it's a kind of collage aesthetic. You have things that are not directly connected, except that they are connected. They're what's on TV. A detective is captured by a mobster who plans to hook him on heroin and then deny him a fix until he reveals the whereabouts of the jealous Hood's former girlfriend. A retarded young man witnesses a murder but is not articulate enough to tell his story to the police. A husband is betrayed in medieval Japan, where adultery is punished by death. Boxed candy includes frog-filled chocolates. Henrietta Hippo believes she can predict the future by reading the letters in her alphabet soup. Henrietta Hippo tries to tell fortunes from the letters in her alphabet soup. Is a kind of a meta joke about poetry itself. The poetry is a kind of alphabet soup in which the way the letters swirl together create different kinds of meaning.
Reveal codes. It is often said that the bladder is an unreliable witness. I felt that way myself coming back from a sluggishly encumbered day at the computer bank.
The reveal codes has a lot of juxtapositions. It has a lot of unstated responses to certain kinds of colloquialisms. It takes language at its word and responds to it. It's very dialogic. All of that to bring the codes or the self-consciousness of the language into audibility and to create a kind of overall rhythmic, stuttering pleasure to the sounding and aesthetics of the poem.
They clammed up like so many turtles in overdrive, but only if you don't know their mercurial propulsions. There's a version that says quell the branches before you braid or at least unload the interfusing hot buttons. Don't know much about chop wax either. Loop the reliquary, some cross-valent comet coming at 50,000 kilobytes per minute per mention. I left the rack at the store but recalled the combination to the cross. He would suck up to an octopus if he thought it would strangle somebody for him.
I grew up in the wake of and very much indebted to visual artists and poets who brought what would at that time been thought of as low culture and debased or vernacular culture into poetry. I mean, maybe most famously Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery in poetry, some of the pop artists. But I also became interested in the opposite, the way in which a lot of my favorite popular artists brought high culture into their work. And I mean, Cole Porter would be an example. You're the Top, has juxtapositions of high culture and low culture constantly, well before the poets that we're talking about, already in the 30s. And so it goes both ways. I mean, I think that nowadays it's easier to accept the idea that there are problematic distinctions between high and low, between vernacular and proper language, that the problem is to think that there's one fixed realm and that it's better than another.
My friend Polly Vocal called the other day just to say hello. I decided not to pick up and returned the call on the machine on her other number. Go on, get down. Do they have a bar here? Short stabs or quick hits, or is there an exit and is it near the exit sign? Is the Pope Polish? Does 3 + 5 = 5 + 3? Is Lincoln buried in Grant's tomb? Is the South Bronx a WASP enclave? Will this burn at Fahrenheit 451? Is Napoleon the president of the Bahamas? Is communism finished? Do hearts break when you don't touch them? Are the rich getting richer, or are you just glad to see me? I didn't give it to you with any sand, so why do you give it to me with sand? Well, Blanche, I just brought the egg over here because the recipe says to separate 2 eggs. Let's call the police!
It's not that any particular form of language is better than another or worse than another, or even the juxtaposition of high and low is better than just having a high diction or just having a low diction. The dominance of elitism, which is now widely debunked, of high culture, isn't any better or worse than the dominance of legibility or representation or accessibility. They're both problematic, and what I'm interested in doing is scrambling those things up.
Make mayonnaise, not munitions. Dispossess the rich, not the poor. Save gas, stay at home. Save electricity, sleep more. Improve your mind, get a vasectomy. No, I'm not hostile, just unhappy. No, I'm not unhappy, just hostile. I mean hospitable. I've been a little grumpy the past few decades. Harder for a rich man to read a poem than for a hippopotamus to sing the bel canto.
If you make language more self-conscious of itself, and puns are a great way to do that, sound play, stuttering, accents, odd phrases, turning things around, or just a juxtaposition of one phrase to another, or taking cliches and putting them in quotes where you're conscious of the clichéness of the cliche, which is something that I do quite a lot, or changing the words. All of these things make you more conscious of the constructedness, the metaphoricity of the metaphors you're using. So I guess my obsession is to bring forward the metaphoricity of metaphor rather than let the metaphor just work. You also hear it as metaphor, and that doing that has a great pleasure to it. It's not a debunking, it's not a suspicion of language, it's not showing the truth beyond language, it's actually intensifying the experience of language through sounding.
Report from Liberty Street was written September 18th to October 1st, 2001. I took a walk on Liberty Street today, only it was not the same place as I had known before.
When September 11th, 2001 occurred, I was right there in Manhattan in the midst of that happening, and I posted on the list that I had started, the Poetics list, which was a large email list, that afternoon, and it was actually based on a kind of I do this, I do that Frank O'Hara poem. It ended, it's 8:11 in New York, very much the way O'Hara does. But it was paratactic. It was talked about the different scenes that I had seen that day. And I wrote maybe 3 or 4 of those entries. And to me, it really was the very heart of my poetics. It was notations without attempt to make it cohere, without making an overall argument. Individual notations, reflections, quotations, one after the other, juxtaposed, contradicting one another.
They thought they were going to heaven. Large crowds surge inside the police barricades, stretching to get a glimpse of the colossal wreck. All that remains of the towers is 2 lattice facades standing upright amidst the rubble. These vast and hollow trunks of steel are mocked by the impervious stare of the neighboring buildings that loom intact over the vacant center. National Guard troops, many no more than teenagers, stand guard over us, the dazzled onlookers, the voyeurs of the disaster, shouting gruffly, yet with a strange and unexpected kindness, move on, you can't stop here. We look on, perhaps not yet ready for despair, against our stronger instincts, which well up boundless and bare. They thought they were going to heaven. There are so many troops that the metaphor of war zone dissolves into an actuality. Liberty Street is an occupied zone. We have occupied ourselves. At Pier A on the Battery, there are 2 giant Apple Think Different ads with blow-up pictures of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, who preside over the scene with unflinching incomprehension. Across the way, the sign on the almost completed The Residencies at the Ritz-Carlton downtown says, "Live in legendary luxury. Occupancy fall 2001. Spectacular views." They thought they were going to heaven. At the checkpoint at Battery and West Street, 4 soldiers check the passes of every vehicle wanting to go north. There is an endless stream of cars, buses filled with workers, pickups, dumpsters, flatbeds. Even police in uniform show their IDs to the soldiers. Battery Park has become a military staging ground, filled with jeeps and tents and soldiers in combat fatigues. Because the park is closed, it's impossible to get to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. They thought they were going to heaven. The movies keep playing in my head. Not the towering inferno, but do you remember in Failsafe, where the president, played by Henry Fonda, launches a nuclear attack on New York to show the Russians that the U.S. attack on Moscow was a mistake? Mr. Chairman, Fonda tells his Russian counterpart, my wife is in New York City today on a shopping trip, and I have her on the phone right now. Mr. Chairman, the phone is dead. So it's almost no surprise to see someone with a t-shirt that says, what part of hatred don't you understand? I guess when 2 planes filled with passengers and tanked up with more fuel than it takes to get my moped from here to Mars and back hits skyscrapers with 20,000 people in them, it doesn't take a political scientist to know there's a lot of hate there. The scary thing is that maybe what they most hated about America is not the bad part. They thought they were going to heaven. I find myself walking around making up arguments in my head, but when I try to write them down, they dissolve in a flood of questions and misgivings. I value these questions, these misgivings, more than my analysis of the situation. They thought they were going to heaven. Still, I don't think this form of monstrousness is only out there. We have our own domestic product. We call it KKK or Timothy McVeigh, Lieutenant Callie, or Dr. Strangelove. They thought they were going to heaven.
I had this idea that America as a sanctuary place for people like my grandparents to come and be safe, or to have a different world, and that this attack on Manhattan was an attack on that.
They thought they were going to heaven. Manhattan as transitional object. Both my parents were born and grew up in New York, their parents having found sanctuary here from places that proved inhospitable. The ghosts of these transplanted souls, along with the ghosts of their many compatriots, haunt the holy warriors with a fury that drives them to seek refuge through the gates of hell. The question isn't, is art up to this? But what else is art for? They thought they were going to heaven. The lone and level sands stretch far away.